Rest in peace. George Floyd, whose death in police custody sparked worldwide protests, is buried today in Houston. We have reaction from the funeral. Debate on defunding. President Donald Trump continues to fight back against calls from Democrats to cut government spending on police departments. Coronavirus crisis. An update on the pandemic as the United States nears 2 million cases. And hard at work. How an order defending Christians in the Holy Land continues its work during the COVID-19 pandemic. On EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, June 9th, 2020. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Tracy Sable. George Floyd, the man killed in police custody late last month and whose death has sparked worldwide protests, was laid to rest today in his hometown of Houston. Among the speakers at the funeral was the city's mayor.
Who would have thought that his name would now be mentioned in South Africa, Canada, Nairobi, Berlin, South Korea, Europe? A person who may not have been known by many before, but what folk meant for evil, God has turned it out for good.
In front of thousands of mourners, Mayor Sylvester Turner also said that he will sign an executive order banning chokeholds by police. Philip Crowther, international affiliate reporter for the Associated Press, joins me now with more from Houston. Philip, welcome back. Good to see you.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
Well, Philip, today's service really was a powerful tribute to George Floyd. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and we just heard actually from the Reverend Al Sharpton, the civil rights leader who delivered and is delivering the eulogy right now for George Floyd here in this enormous church on the outskirts of Houston. It has been a mournful tribute to George Floyd, a tribute to him, but at the very same time, of course, you cannot forget, and nobody inside this church can forget, the bigger subjects at hand, the protests that, of course, happened after the death of George Floyd. Let me give you some examples of who we heard from during this funeral here in Houston. We heard from family members of George Floyd. His niece, for example, saying this in reference to the president's election slogan. She says, "Someone said, 'Make America Great Again.' When was America great?" she said. And then we heard, by the way, also from the former Vice President Joe Biden, not in person. He was here in Houston yesterday to meet with family members of George Floyd. He sent over a video message in tribute to George Floyd, but again, of course, made a reference to this historic moment that the United States is going through right now.
Well, as you just mentioned, George Floyd's death has sparked protests across the country. I know that you've covered some of those in Washington and Minneapolis, as well as memorial services in Minneapolis and now in Houston. Let's talk about the impact that George Floyd had on this nation.
Yeah, it's an enormous impact that he's had. He's been described here by pastors and by friends and family as a humble man from humble beginnings who did say he wanted to become famous one day, but of course not in this way. But tributes here being paid to George Floyd as somebody who managed to change the world after his death. Those are the kinds of tributes we have been hearing here about the 46-year-old man who died in Minneapolis now just over 2 weeks ago. We've really seen a little shift, though, in the feeling, if you will, in protests over the last few weeks. The anger seems to have subsided somewhat. Now there seems to be that space for an serious, deep, earnest discussion in this country about race relations, about police brutality, about the lack of equality. Those are all subject matters that came up in this funeral here in Houston. And the protesters and those also who came here yesterday for the public viewing of the body of George Floyd, all of these people want to talk about these difficult subject matters right now. It does seem a little bit like an inflection point right now.
Yeah, Philip, and his death has renewed conversations about race and policing in this country. Protests are calling for big changes, and we've already seen some movement already since George Floyd's death.
Yes, and a lot of those are happening at a local level, for example. As you just heard from the mayor of Houston, the fact that chokeholds would not be allowed anymore here in Houston by the police force. The same happening in other states, in other cities, and indeed in other countries, like in France, for example, a reaction to the protests happening in that country as well. Just another sign of how this has turned into a worldwide protest movement. As for changes on the national level, well, we know that those will be discussed up on Capitol Hill over the next few weeks and months. But of course, most likely we are going to see further division, as we know, between Democrats and Republicans, including on this subject matter as well.
No, Philip, thank you so much for your time. Philip Crowther, international affiliate reporter for the Associated Press. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Some people want to defund police departments in the wake of George Floyd's death, but President Donald Trump is showing his support for officers on Twitter. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reports. Owen?
Tracy, here at the White House, President Trump has been very vocal in his support for police, tweeting today defunding police would be good for robbers and rapists. President Donald Trump speaking at this roundtable with law enforcement, which in recent weeks has come under intense scrutiny here and across the globe. Protest after protest, march after march, all sparked by George Floyd's death while in custody.
We can't give up the finest law enforcement anywhere in the world. There's nothing like it.
And as for talk of gutting police departments,
we won't be defunding our police. We won't be dismantling our police. We won't be disbanding our police.
And the Attorney General emphasizes the rule of law.
We have to make sure, it's our responsibility to make sure that our country is ruled by law and not by violence.
But in Minneapolis, the city council says the trust in police is gone.
I'll agree that the Minneapolis Police Department cannot be reformed.
And she says the officers themselves believe the system's broken as well.
They don't want to be in a position where 1 week after they graduate from our police cadet class, they are now in court being charged for murder. No officer wants to be in that position.
They just did away with chokeholds. So did Denver's department. But one big city police chief worries about active shooters, including one that happened in Ohio. And if police are not properly armed,
that suspect was about to enter a very crowded nightclub with a 100-drum magazine, with 100-round drum magazine.
He says lives were saved that day.
And an officer with the patrol rifle that some people would consider a military-type weapon was able to stop him, take him down before he killed many others. So we need to just slow down.
Now, when it comes to concerns over militarization of the police, the chief you saw there also says it's not about the equipment, but instead it's about proper training. Tracy.
All right. Thank you, Owen. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reporting for us tonight. While congressional Democrats rallied yesterday with bold police reform legislation, Republicans are looking to unveil measures of their own this week. Laws that Republicans say can bring some real change with the way police work is done. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales reports. Eric?
That's right, Tracy. Republicans on Capitol Hill tell EWTN that they're preparing their own proposals when it comes to police reform. Meanwhile, Democrats say that they continue to push their own legislation.
Democrats are going to fight very, very hard to make this proposal a reality.
The Justice in Policing Act announced by congressional Democrats yesterday would hold law enforcement accountable for misconduct in court, improve transparency through data collection, and reform police training and policies. Democratic Senator Tim Kaine supports the bill's goals.
These are things that make common sense. These are things that will pass the House. In the Senate, needing to get 60 votes, we're going to have to work very hard with our colleagues to do that.
Some of those colleagues are joining Republican Tim Scott from South Carolina, backing a different bill, one Senator Scott is sponsoring, for reporting requirements for police.
What we don't know is how many times this occurs, and we need to understand those trends. And so, again, I've joined Senator Scott in this effort. We want those jurisdictions that receive federal dollars to do the proper reporting.
And Republicans are calling for cooperation between police and communities.
Then I think we'll have buy-in both from the community as well as from police, and that way we begin to institute these reforms that would have kept George Floyd from dying.
Tomorrow in the House, George Floyd's brother will testify before the Judiciary Committee. Ranking member Jim Jordan tells me.
American people know that what happened in Minneapolis was wrong, and that the individuals who did this who killed Mr. Floyd deserve justice, and they deserve swift justice and the full measure of justice.
Congressman Jim Jordan tells me that the Democrats' idea to defund police departments is, quote, crazy. He says that he predicts that that's going to be an issue at the hearing tomorrow. He says what Democrats have to realize is when you defund police departments, you're taking away resources from the police departments, and that's going to hurt disadvantaged communities. Tracy?
Correspondent Eric Rosales reporting from Capitol Hill tonight. Thank you, Eric. The coronavirus has infected more than 1.9 million Americans over the past few months. That is according to Johns Hopkins University. And now some states are seeing a new spike in cases. New York City is starting to move forward.
We're not out of the woods, but we are on the other side. Certainly.
The Big Apple is in phase 1 of the reopening process after months of COVID-19 restrictions.
Stay away from people who are in a vulnerable population until you take a test and you know that you're not infected.
22 states, the ones here in red and orange, are seeing a jump in new cases. Among them, Florida, which saw an increase of about 46% over the past week, just as most of the state entered its second reopening phase. The lifting of social distancing restrictions and the nationwide police brutality protests are likely factors in the increase of infections.
COVID-19 is going to be here for a little bit. Hopefully we'll get a vaccine and then, our scientists deal with it. But the people need to deal with this.
One thing that is likely not a factor, people who are not showing symptoms. The World Health Organization now says it is rare for someone who's asymptomatic to infect others, and that discovery may make a difference.
It gives contact tracers a better sense of who to focus on to make sure that the right people are getting isolated and the right contacts are also getting quarantined.
And another finding from the medical community, a study of 6 countries published in the scientific journal Nature finds shutdowns probably prevented about 62 million confirmed COVID-19 cases, including nearly 4.8 million in the U.S. There is chaos and confusion in Britain over plans to reopen schools before summer vacation starts. Prime Minister Boris Johnson wanted schools to reopen this month so parents can go back to work. And some children did start to return to schools last week, but only a small percentage. Administrators and principals are worried it's not possible for school children to maintain social distancing. New satellite photos show Iran is apparently using a fake aircraft carrier for target practice. The satellite photos show a carrier complete with 16 mock fighter jets. Both are similar to those used by the American Navy. However, this is not the first time. Back in 2015, Iran also constructed a fake carrier that was used during military exercises. Today marks 1 year since protesters in Hong Kong started a pro-democracy movement. Hundreds defied police warnings and shouted slogans, including Hong Kong independence, earlier today. Riot police fired tear gas at one point and charged a group of protesters, tackling some to the ground. Last year, 1 million people rallied in central Hong Kong, sparking the Hong Kong pro-democracy movement and months of street protests. North Korea cuts communications with South Korea because activists are still sending messages over the border. The North is also frustrated because South Korea has not persuaded the United States to ease sanctions. Today, South Korean officials tried to contact officials in the North using a special hotline, but no one answered. Coming up, analysis of early polling numbers in the race for the White House. With 5 months to go before the presidential election, a new national poll shows President Donald Trump trailing Democratic challenger Joe Biden. According to a CNN survey, 55% of those responding said if the election were being held today, they would be more likely to vote for Biden. 41%, they would be more likely to vote for President Trump. Joining me now on Skype with his analysis is Dr. Michael Cohen, CEO of the Cohen Research Group, a political research and technology firm. Michael, welcome to the show. Good to see you. So what do you make of these results?
Well, thanks for having me on. The results, I would characterize them as an outlier. You're looking at a 14-point lead. There's no way in the world that's going to happen in November.
Critics of the poll point to bias against the president by some in the mainstream media. What are your thoughts on that, Michael?
Well, I looked at the poll, and what they're doing is they're looking at registered voters. They're not even looking at likely voters. And on top of that, we really have no sense of how they sampled those voters. The best way to do it is to look at the voter file, check who voted last time, or maybe even the last 4 elections, and then take a sample of people to go ahead and interview them from here. They likely didn't do that. And in fact, that is really the state of the art on how we do polling today.
What about the internal polling by the White House? What is that showing?
I'm sure the internal White House polling is showing that Trump is down, but I would imagine it's much closer. And in fact, what they're looking at is not even national polling at this point, because professional pollsters and the White House team, and I know a few people on that team, they're very, very good. And what it comes down to is this, they're looking at it state by state. And so all of the states that were very close last time, those are the ones that they're focused on.
As you know, the nation has been in the midst of a pandemic that's caused not just a health crisis, but also an economic one as well. And now there is unrest in the wake of the death of George Floyd. How much of an impact do you think this is going to have on voters?
Well, it's had a significant impact so far. So if you look at the Real Clear Politics aggregate polling for the past few months, on May 18th, Biden was up about 5%. He's now up about 8%. So there is some kind of movement, but it's not exactly really significant. So you're looking at these things, they're crises, they're points in time. I would imagine that the protests will eventually dissipate with congressional action, and hopefully the president will sign it. And beyond that, we'll probably be on to 3, 4, 5 other things by the time we get to November.
Yeah, Michael, before we let you go, what else do you think we need to look for in the upcoming election?
What you need to be looking for is when these two candidates actually debate. That's really when voters start looking at the election more seriously. The conventions will be a little bit less important this time around because they're not going to be in person, or maybe even the Democrats won't have theirs in person, but maybe the Republicans will. So there's not going to be much of a bump coming out of that. When they go head to head, that's when this thing will get ready to go.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for your time. Dr. Michael Cohen, CEO of the Cohen Research Group. Thanks for coming on the show. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Up next, Pope Francis names a new head for a diocese in Texas. And we hear about efforts to help Christians in the Holy Land. Order dedicated to helping Christians in the Holy Land continues its efforts during the coronavirus crisis. Around 20 members of the Equestrian Order of the Holy Sepulchre held their annual meeting last Friday online. Those taking part included Cardinal Fernando Filoni, the order's Grand Master. The order has around 30,000 members worldwide. Leonardo Visconti, Governor General of the Equestrian Order of the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem, joins us now from Rome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for asking me to be with you.
Well, first off, can you tell us a little bit about your order and the work that it does for Christians in the Holy Land?
Well, our order is composed by 30,000 members all over the world. I wish to underline all over the world. We have half of our members are from North America, but we have several members in Europe, several members in South America, in Asia, in Australia. So we are all over the world. And we depend directly from the Holy Father. We are an order of the Church. We are part of the Church, actually. The Order of the Holy Sepulchre is considered an operative branch of the Holy Father in the Holy Land. Now, what is the purpose of the order? The purpose of the order is to maintain the Christians' presence in the Holy Land and to help people living there who are, as we all know, in a very difficult situation, especially right now with a sanitary emergency. And we collect funds from our members, and we provide, through the Latin Patriarchate in Jerusalem, we provide help for the Christians living there, but not only for the Christians, because we also have Muslim people going to our schools, for instance, to our hospitals, to our elderly houses, and we help those people to maintain their decent level of life, and we try to help also the presence of the Catholic Church in the institutions, in the parishes, and this is something very important, because the amount of Christians living in the Holy Land has diminished in the years, and it's always diminishing because of the difficulties they find.
Leonardo, I'm curious, how has the corona crisis affected Christians in the region?
Well, the COVID crisis affected all the world. As we all know, there's no part of the world that is not being affected. But it was particularly hard especially in Palestine and Jordan, because of the situation there. And the schools, our schools, which are very important, because through the schools we form the new generations, and we form them with our values. And these schools suffered tremendously because of the difficulties of distance teaching. But in the Holy Land was particularly hard.
Well, Leonardo, thank you so much
Please.
For your time. We really appreciate it. And we hope to have you back on again. Leonardo Visconti, Governor General of the Equestrian Order of the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Pope Francis names a new head of the Diocese of Beaumont, Texas. Monsignor David Toops currently is the rector of a seminary in Boynton Beach, Florida. The 49-year-old was ordained in 1997. He is fluent in English and Spanish. He succeeds Bishop of Curtis Gilroy. The 76-year-old had led the diocese since 2000. The Diocese of Beaumont has nearly 70,000 Catholics. We thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Tracy Sable. We're back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night and God bless.